Hi, I'm Ben Llewellyn and I'm looking today at Wales and Scotland, not what makes them similar or the same, but what makes them different. In this 4-part series, I'll be looking at Wales and Scotland's identities through their languages and how radically different they are. I'll show you how since at least the Ice Age, Wales and Scotland's landscapes have formed in contrast. We will see how separate legal systems created different modern democracies. And we will delve into the Renaissance, in which Wales and Scotland took journeys which could not be further apart. If you're new here, why not subscribe so you can catch the entire series? And if you leave a like, I'd really appreciate it. If you're just coming into the series in this episode, here's a link to my last episode here. If Wales and Scotland were any more different for landscape, they wouldn't be part of the same island. They've got almost nothing in relation other than they are part of the same island. As far as the size of these two countries, which is the first thing to build on, Wales is about the size of Israel. And Scotland is about the size of the Czech Republic. So right from the bat off, these are very different sizes we're talking about. These are both very mountainous countries. Scotland's highest mountain is Ben Nevis, and it's also the highest mountain in Britain, which is 1,345 meters high. The highest mountain in Wales is Rhywyddfa, which is 1,085 meters high. The mountains of these countries were formed very differently during the Ice Age. So as you can see here, Scotland was completely covered by the ice in the Ice Age. Wales was mostly covered, but the peripheral fringes of its south of the country of Wales were not covered in ice, which created a steep rise up. But we have the valleys today and the Priscillian Mountains, and then you dip down into a very fertile, very rich farming land in the southern periphery of Wales, which is a very narrow strip. Scotland has these elongated ridges going northeast to southwest, which form these hollowed out landscapes going to the horizon in two directions, and they form lochs on the or extended elongated bodies of water. Wales, on the other hand, its valleys are shaped by the different ways in which the water either melted off and formed collection points of water, or where the ice compressed the land. And as you can see from this map here, there are different zones across the British Isles in terms of how the land is still reacting to the ice being upon it. Now the northern part of Wales is still rising from the Ice Age, like almost all of Scotland. But Wales, unlike Scotland, has 3 different zones relative to that Ice Age. Scotland is, well, over 85%, in which it's still rising out of that deep, long compression in the ice. Because of this, Scotland has these long ridges, and between these, you have settlements. The biggest one of these is the Central Belt, which isn't very central at all. It's more like the waste of Scotland, around the lower bit. And this photo here is where my grandfather's namesake comes from in Scotland, and my middle name, but that's another story. Central Belt holds over 60% of Scotland's population. It's a long, fertile area where you have lots of human settlement. Glasgow, Edinburgh. Wales, on the other hand, doesn't have any central belt like this. The middle of the country is where the mountains are. The settlements and the more fertile land is sprinkled around the mountains, on the edges, on the periphery. So Wales as a country couldn't unify in the same way that Scotland could. And this left a deep impact upon not only the Welsh identity and its languages, but where the cities actually formed, how they formed, when they formed. They formed very late compared to Scotland. And because Scotland formed its cities very early. Well, Edinburgh is quite majestic because of where it is, but you had political power that was able to coalesce in Scotland much earlier, which has changed the Scottish people in a way that Wales is just beginning to experience today. Another key thing that's different between Wales and Scotland as far as geography goes is their relative geographic location with England, with whom they both share a border. The Welsh border extends the length and breadth of its country and is 160 miles, 260 kilometers. Scotland, on the other hand's border with England is much narrower. It's not the breadth of its country. It's 96 miles across from the Solway Firth to the North Sea, 154 kilometers. Now this has a profound impact upon how these two nations relate with their neighbour. For Scotland, there's a distance. You can keep things at arm's length because the majority of the country of Scotland is closer to Edinburgh than it is to England. On the other hand, Wales, the majority of the Welsh nation is closer to England than it is to Cardiff, its capital city. And this presents problems in terms of self-referencing, self-identification for Wales, which doesn't quite exist in Scotland. People are very proudly Welsh. When you have a large percentage of your population identifying more with Liverpool, a city in England, rather than Cardiff, a city in Wales, it does present some issues sociologically which are not really resolved in Wales at this present time. Scotland, on the other hand, doesn't really have that issue to any great extent. There are large conurbations, large cities in Scotland that serve all the needs of all its people. Wales doesn't have that. Now, if you're in Fort William in Scotland and you want to get to Edinburgh, you do have to go on quite a long, arduous journey over mountain ranges, but you don't have to go through England. The entire process is an inter-Scottish travel and identity, which rebuttresses a sense of Scottish identity and sense of space that you don't quite get in Wales. The Welsh language even has a word, agororau, which is a sense of borderlands being interwoven with another identity. And this is born out of the idea that Wales is so interwoven with England because of the geography of these two nations. Scotland really isn't to that same extent. Scotland is famous for its islands, and rightly so. They are beautiful. But Wales has islands as well. Fewer of them, just above 50, while Scotland has, well, it depends how you count it, but 790 islands by my count, which is quite considerable. But Wales's islands are very different in terms of where they are in relation to where they are in Scotland. In Wales, you have a lot of islands in a concentrated area around Pembrokeshire on the south coast, along the Severn Estuary. And you do have Ynys Môn in the north, of course. In Scotland, you have a long arc, an archipelago of several archipelagos of islands, the Outer Hebrides and so on, in the northwest of the country. And this forms a large continuous identity, a region, an island region identity, which you don't have to the same extent in Wales. Well, you do in Ynys Môn, but it's a single island. The coasts of Wales and Scotland are very different to each other as well. They both have 3 coastlines, but they're not faced the same way. They're exposed to very different elements and seas. In Wales, you have the south coast facing the Severn Estuary, which is a bit warmer. And then you go around to the west and you have Bay Ceredigion facing the Celtic Sea, and it's a much more oceanic feel. And on the north coast, you have a coast which faces an inland archipelago sea. In Scotland, you do have kind of a narrow strip on the south that does face this archipelago sea, but it's very different to Wales's estuary facing south coast. On the west coast of Scotland, intermingled with hundreds of islands, you have a rugged, wind-blown, harsh, that's very discontinuous and broken In the far north, you do have kind of a fourth coast facing solidly north, exposed to very cold winds, but it could be said that that's really sort of part of the east coast. The east coast of Scotland is facing the North Sea, but it's not as wet as the west coast, and it's not as wet as any coast that Wales has. And this is a marked difference that grants it more sunlight in the east than anywhere in Wales. Now, Scotland is not some kind of paradise, but it does have this more fertile agricultural sector in the east of Scotland because there's more sunshine. You can grow crops at a higher rate than you can in, say, Wales. Scotland has a dividing line again. It's sort of east-west, but it's more like southeast-northwest, and that's the Highland Zone and the Lowland Zone. And this follows in that the east coast of Scotland is entirely within this lowland zone. Wales doesn't have this. The upland zone of Wales is in the middle of Wales, and it has long ridges extending out in kind of nose formations, so that Wales is broken up in a way that Scotland's not. This has a profound impact upon Welsh and Scottish society. They're very, very different in terms of how different regions within their country relate to each other. Cymru is and always has been much more localized and often divided than Scotland, although Scotland does have that division and has historically had at times animosity between the Highlands and Lowlands, especially regarding the kind of Scots Anglo culture and the Gaelic culture, in which there was open hostility at points in its history. Wales, on the other hand, didn't have that stark division between one large region and another large region. It was more of a patchwork, a quilt work of interwoven regions. The Welsh language even has a word for it, bro, which is not a region, a localized heartland of a regional culture. And it's the landscape of Wales that produces the idea that you can have such a regional identity. Not to say one is better than the other, these are just vastly different landscapes which create different social conditions. And if you're going to say that Wales and Scotland are so similar that you're locked in the struggle against the English together, it doesn't follow, because the culture of these two countries, shaped by the land, is just so utterly different. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next episode of this series.